It's 1929. Young people are partying like all the money's about to disappear. The world fought the war to end all wars, survived the flu, and everything has been stellar ever since, so long as your side won. Women can vote, and a few of them make a living getting naked on stage, and gee, their business cards make great wall decorations. Surely we're only a year or two away from people realizing they can basically print money by pasting half-dressed women onto beer advertisements. Oh shoot. So far, we've covered about 8 decades, from the mid-1800s to 1930. The conditions are there for pinups to sell like hotcakes, or at least they were. But like a lot of things in the 30s, the Great Depression was a setback. This historic video series is brought to you by the Historic Autographs Company. You can find trading cards and relics related to the history explored here on our website, link in the description. Our up-and-coming 2023 product, Mob 2, has a chance to pull Mob pinup cards, as well as relic cards with Al Capone's tablecloth, original film frames, Whitey Bulger's autograph, and more. Thanks for watching, and remember to like and subscribe for more content. Episode 3: Prohibition and Depression. We actually have to backtrack a bit. As new ideas and old ideas fought for dominance in a post-war society, some new rules were ushered in. We passed right over the biggest one: Prohibition. Prohibition itself didn't hamper the tide of young adults rejecting traditions and partying. If anything, it encouraged them by making them more rules to break. But Prohibition is tied to movements that did prevent pinups from being more widespread. Prohibition was a movement spearheaded primarily by religious circles, including subgroups of Protestants and the Women's Christian Temperance Union. It was a progressive movement aimed at improving society by getting rid of alcohol, which voices within these groups argued was a primary source of societal degeneracy, like domestic violence, political corruption, and unemployment. In 1920, they were successful. The 18th Amendment prohibited the sale and distribution of alcoholic beverages. There is conflicting information as to whether or not Prohibition successfully reduced alcohol consumption, especially thanks to the black market and organized crime groups that took it upon themselves to encourage it. We now know that the American mob had a significant role in organized crime based in alcohol, drugs, gambling, smuggling, the list goes on. Now, what does this have to do with pinups? Just as some religious groups and progressive circles were calling for a ban on alcohol in the name of purifying society, the same or similar groups were calling for restrictions on the increasingly explicit content that was gradually becoming more accessible. By the end of the 20s, the average burlesque show had changed courses away from musical comedy acts and more towards solo striptease acts featuring nudity. Individual performers made names for themselves by developing their own style and niche, making these late 20s, early 30s burlesque stars among the first X-ish rated celebrities. For example, take Rose Louise Hovick, better known by the stage name Gypsy Rose Lee. She was known for her witty striptease performance in the early 30s, enough that her name is still recognizable today. Rose and other stars like her advertised themselves on business cards, often featuring themselves in startlingly little clothing. Some people took to hanging these cards on walls, and thus the 20s and 30s saw the creation of the proto-pinup, as burlesque stars handed out near-illicit imagery in the form of mass-produced portable prints that people put on walls. Comparatively speaking, racy photographs were becoming more and more mainstream. It wouldn't last long. The venues and the companies putting on these shows faced increasing pressure to shut down from religious groups and their supporters, especially when they started getting the law involved. That would take a couple more years, though, and we want to stay in the early 1930s for now. Now, I don't mean to imply that the early 1930s was a great place to be. The stock market crash of 1929 put a sudden and brutal end to the once endless growth of the 20s. Important to our case, women's standing in society shifted again. Women had won the ability to vote, and thanks to World War I, they finally had an opportunity to learn trades and make their own money. But in nearly an instant, the celebration was over. The flapper died seemingly overnight. Fashion trends were expensive. And as the Great Depression settled into America, there was a pull for women's fashion to return to the stern formality last seen before the 20s. Perhaps aided by a social disdain for the frivolity and consumerism that the people, in a way, blamed the Depression on. Unsurprisingly, it was a turbulent time. People wanted to return to what they saw as normal, be it simpler times before the war or shinier times in the 20s, yet the Depression dragged on. With so many competing interests, families struggling at home, businesses struggling to stay afloat, social movements struggling to hold their ground, it was not going to be easy to push forward or backward. Young women enjoyed freedom of dress and resisted the legal push to bring back strict dress codes. Meanwhile, women that had fought for their rights were also fighting to end alcoholism and the commodification of women now that all young men who were traumatized from the war were home and expected to start families. Again, turbulent times, but despite the economic downturn and social development being gridlocked, a certain industry had just started to experience its golden age. Let's take a look at Hollywood. Film was silent until the end of the 20s. When sound films became viable for the public, it opened a new world of opportunities to filmmakers. Between 1927 and 1969, Hollywood released several classic films, including Citizen Kane, Gone with the Wind, and so on. Film would become a large part of American culture and, as mentioned with Theda Bara in the last episode, had already been experimenting with towing the line of explicit content in silent films since the early 1910s. Hollywood had no intent to stop either. With actors and actresses migrating from the struggling theater industry to the blossoming film industry, Hollywood was primed for its golden age. Hollywood made all kinds of stuff. Sexual innuendo, violence, profanity, hubris. Hollywood was an unregulated market. The populace ate it up. But they also criticized the heck out of it. Just as people went after burlesque, people went after Hollywood for what they deemed unsuitable content. And from the 1910s into the early 30s, Hollywood grappled with scandals, and hundreds of individual states' new film decency laws, and the church, and concerned parents. Hollywood had already instituted its own organization as a conglomerate of studio companies, and in the late 20s, that structure instituted the Hays Code. The Hays Code was messy. It banned and or discouraged content that was sexually suggestive or overly violent or overly intimate, or content that criticized other countries or the church, or content that sympathized with criminals. The most common critique of the Hays Code is that it banned a lot of interesting forms of conflict, and that it was selectively enforced. In short, suggestive content was still being produced, but the Hays Code was still very much effective at limiting what content Hollywood produced for the entirety of its use, 1934 to 1968. Let's zoom out a bit and look at the bigger picture. The Great Depression was a tumultuous period with a lot of tug-of-war over countless individual issues. Women's rights, sexuality displayed in media, suggestive content, advertising, all of these were being disputed. But just hold up a second. What does this have to do with pinups? What does any of this have to do with pinups? Well, sure, we could talk about pinups starting with when they're first created in 1940, but we were just talking about 5 years prior to that. Just 5 years before pinup girls became an American cultural icon, large-scale social movements were working to remove even suggested disrobing from mass media. Pinups are a strictly American phenomenon that sprung out of an age where society's expectations for women changed dramatically every 5 years. And that only becomes more interesting the more you look into the cultural development leading up to their inception. This leads us back to our last stepping stone before the 40s, and the one medium that was far enough from the busy streets of Broadway and Hollywood to avoid the bulk of the public scrutiny. Men's magazines, namely Esquire. Esquire Men's Magazine hosted a number of artists throughout the 30s and into the 40s, including Alberto Vargas, known for his token Vargas Girls, and George Petty, known for his Petty Girls. Both of these artists would go on to be famous for their pinups and respective art styles. The characters they drew were rendered in soft, warm gradients and color palettes, and idealized figures. Both of these artists would have their art published and shipped overseas to soldiers in World War II, where they became inherently tied to World War II history. But that's for another video. That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. Tune in for the next episode as we continue to explore the history of pinups. And don't forget to check out the website to peruse Historic Autographs products.